All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating slice of history, the massive wave of Scottish UFO sightings that took place from the 1970s straight through the 1990s. We're going to dig into the sheer volume of these sightings, crack open the secret government files that tried to explain them, and see how the whole thing evolved into a modern cultural phenomenon. It is an absolutely brilliant case study in how the unexplained crashes headfirst into society, the media, and official government records. Picture this for a second. It's 1990s Scotland. You're living in a quiet, working-class town. Maybe you're a forestry worker heading home through the woods, or you're just driving down an isolated highway late at night. And suddenly, the sky lights up with something completely unexplainable. So, what exactly was hiding up there? Were these actual extraterrestrial visitors? Was it classified military testing? Or was it all just psychological? During this time, there was this incredible, palpable tension between the extraordinary claims coming from terrified locals and the very grounded, very dry, official explanations coming from the government.
Now, to really wrap our heads around the scale of what we're dealing with, we need to talk numbers. 800. That is the staggering number of UFO sightings officially reported to the British Ministry of Defense in just a tiny 4-year window, between 1993 and 1996. So we're not just talking about a couple of isolated prank calls to the local police. This was a massive, highly documented wave of public reporting that the authorities simply could not ignore.
Okay, moving on to Section 1, Scotland's UFO hotspots. Things escalated pretty quickly, and these major Scottish incidents really built on each other over time. It all kicked off back in 1979 with the infamous Detchment Woods incident. Then, as we roll into the 90s, you get the 1990 Calvine photograph, which is this highly contested image of a diamond-shaped object being shadowed by a fighter jet. By 1992, we're seeing widespread reports of lights over Fife, plus the truly terrifying A70 highway abduction claim. And then, the whole thing just peaks in the mid-90s with an intense wave of sightings, heavily concentrated over the town of Bonnybridge. You can really see how the phenomenon compounded over the years, snowballing into a full-blown national frenzy. And man, the international media just ate this up. I mean, check out this headline from the U.S. edition of the National Enquirer in June 1995. Town in panic over 2,000 UFO sightings. The frenzy had essentially zeroed in on that small town of Bonnybridge. The media narrative was just totally explosive. They were projecting this image of a rural community literally under siege by the unknown, and it captured the imagination of the entire world. Now, the tabloids were shouting about 2,000 sightings, but local investigator Malcolm Robinson, he put the estimate at a slightly more grounded, but honestly still mind-blowing, 350 sightings in the Bonnybridge region alone since 1982. He even went as far as dubbing the area the world's #1 UFO hotspot. But whether you believe the hyped-up tabloid numbers or the local researchers, the sheer volume of reports pouring out of this one specific geographic area is just undeniable. Which brings us to Section 2, the paranormal investigator. So who is this Malcolm Robinson? Well, he founded Strange Phenomena Investigations, or SPI, back in 1979. And what I find absolutely fascinating about this is that Robinson actually started out as a total skeptic. His original goal was to debunk these claims and prove they were just utter nonsense. But after spending time listening to first-hand accounts, his approach totally shifted. He pivoted to systematic field investigations, and SPI quickly became Scotland's oldest dedicated group for documenting and analyzing these bizarre events. Because we have to remember, SPI wasn't just chasing, blurry lights in the sky. Take that 1979 Detchment Woods case, for example. A forestry worker named Robert Taylor reported being physically dragged by these smaller spheres that dropped from a massive 20-foot object. He claimed they were emitting a hissing sound and a terrible acrid smell. He actually lost consciousness, and when he woke up, there were literal ladder-like ground traces all around him, and his clothing was torn. This case is historic because the local police actually investigated it as a criminal assault. It's exactly that kind of physical, tangible evidence that transformed investigators like Robinson from skeptics into incredibly dedicated researchers. And this shift led SPI to develop a surprisingly rigorous investigatory methodology. They didn't just take people at their word. Step 1 was conducting private recorded interviews to establish a baseline of credibility. Step 2 meant doing the empirical legwork, cross-checking the claims against meteorological data and aviation flight logs. Step 3 was heading out into the field for actual overnight site vigils. And finally, Step 4 was layering in the tech,
We're talking EMF meters, infrared cameras, barrier alarms, the whole shebang. It was a really fascinating hybrid approach that blended highly subjective human testimony with whatever technology they could get their hands on.
Let's dive into Section 3, Government Secrets and Explanations.
So what did the government make of all this? Well, the Ministry of Defense was incredibly firm. Their official stance stated that there is, quote, no evidence whatsoever to suggest that intelligent life from outer space or alien spacecraft have landed on our planet. This is, of course, a massive contrast to the fervent beliefs of the local investigators and the terrified eyewitnesses we just talked about. But you have to understand, the MOD's primary concern was defense. They just wanted to know if these objects breached UK airspace. They really weren't concerned with whether or not they came from another galaxy. There was this massive disconnect between what the public thought they saw and the official government reality. Here's a perfect example. In 1993 and 1994, dozens of witnesses reported seeing a terrifying, brilliantly illuminated oval object hovering menacingly in the sky. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? While meticulous MOD documentation reveals it was a Virgin airship. Yep, a blimp. And it was up there advertising the launch of the new Ford Mondeo. Many people simply refused to believe the official explanation, which really highlights the immense gap between a witness's genuine sense of awe and terror and a completely mundane marketing stunt. Honestly, some of the MOD's explanations are almost funny when you line them up against the witness reports. Let me give you a few. 2 terrified youths reported that their skin turned glowing red before a lemon-headed alien offered to abduct them. The police investigated and found out it was just a local farmer crop spraying in a nearby field. In another instance, 70 police and military witnesses saw a silent, catamaran-shaped megacraft, but radar checks and U.S. inquiries later confirmed it was simply a Russian Cosmos satellite rocket re-entering the atmosphere. And that famous Kelvin photo of a diamond shadowed by a jet? The MOD chalked it up to suspected classified military testing. They systematically, meticulously explained away the bizarre. If you look at the MOD's data, you've got a pretty steady baseline in 93 and 94, and then boom, 1996 hits and we're looking at a massive spike of 609 sightings. So what was the MOD's explanation for that sudden surge? Pop culture. Specifically, 1996 was the year The X-Files became a massive broadcast hit on British TV. It's a vivid illustration of how the media we consume can directly influence what we think we're seeing when we look up at the night sky. This leads us perfectly into Section 4, the skeptical perspective. Naturally, skeptics like Brian Ego and folks in the broader scientific community, they have a pretty firm counterargument to all this. They point out that these paranormal investigations rely way too heavily on unproven, anecdotal testimony, and they almost completely lack verifiable physical artifacts. They also argue that investigators often fall victim to confirmation bias, conveniently omitting counterexamples that might ruin a really good story. Ultimately, science demands repeatable experiments, and UFO sightings, well, they're notoriously subjective, heavily influenced by human psychology, memory distortion, and simple misidentifications of things like weather balloons, aircraft, or weird atmospheric effects. But here's what I think is the absolute craziest takeaway of all. The firm skeptics and the dedicated paranormal investigators like Malcolm Robinson, they actually agree on one massive point. Up to 99% of all UFO sightings have entirely rational terrestrial explanations. All those massive flaps, the thousands of reports, almost all of it boils down to weather balloons, tricks of the light, or airplanes. The entire debate, the entire enduring mystery, hinges entirely on that remaining unexplained 1%. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, a modern cultural phenomenon. All of this activity literally put these Scottish towns on the map, but a very different kind of map. You know how the Bermuda Triangle became this globally recognized mythical zone for disappearances? Well, the media quickly coined the term the Bonny Bridge Triangle, or sometimes the Falkirk Triangle. It completely transformed a quiet, small Scottish town into a focal point for modern mythology, forever linking its identity to the unexplained. In this folklore, it had real, tangible socioeconomic impacts. Local hotels actually started offering UFO weekend breaks to tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of a saucer. There were serious proposals drafted for a UFO tourist center to boost the local economy. Falkirk Town Hall hosted packed public lectures. Books by authors like Patrick Gunn and Malcolm Robinson were flying off the shelves. And the whole frenzy even spawned academic analyses by university researchers like Dr. Gavin Miller. So, regardless of whether the UFOs themselves were real, the cultural and economic effects on these communities absolutely were. The phenomenon literally became an industry.
The mainstream broadsheet journalists of the time really hit the nail on the head. They called the Bonny Bridge Triangle the 90s equivalent of Nessie. And it's just a perfect comparison, isn't it? It shows how these UFO flaps were really just a modern iteration of classic Scottish folklore. We basically just swapped out a monster hiding in the deep water for flying saucers hiding in the deep sky.
So, what does this all mean when we look back at the classified Mo files? The dedicated investigators tramping through the woods, and the genuinely terrified locals. Does the ultimate truth of these sightings lie up there in the stars, or does it actually lie in the human mind and our deep, enduring need to confront and organize the unexplained? Whatever conclusion you come to, the Scottish UFO flaps remain an absolutely brilliant, captivating chapter of modern history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep looking up.